So I guess my first question would be, do you find it annoying when people downplay the difficulties of having ADHD?
That's a good question. I think I can understand. Am I freezing?
A little bit, but yeah, now you're good now.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can understand and relate with people that get frustrated or annoyed when other people don't seem to understand ADHD. Um, I think I've come to a place a little bit more in my life where um, there's more acceptance and understanding that not everyone has gained the education that I have on my specific neurodivergence. And so I think I have a little bit more patience and grace and room for informing or just letting people know about the struggles of ADHD instead of thinking that everyone should know, because there's a lot of different neurodivergence out there. There's a lot of different lifestyles and cultures and religions or whatever it might be that I would love to respect and understand. But because it's not necessarily my hyper focus or doesn't impact me as directly as ADHD does for me, that I don't know about them as well. So I think I get frustrated maybe when I've already talked to someone about it multiple times and they still continue to get frustrated or they don't make adjustments. I would say in that case, it would be a little bit more frustrating. That happens sometimes in like my marriage, for example. My husband is very, very neurotypical. And when I see him trying to interact with our daughter, who's almost 8, and like he'll ask her to come up for dinner and he'll ask her like with only 2 seconds in between each time instead of waiting for her to come up or going downstairs and actually telling her, making sure there's eye contact, etc. I mean, there's frustration there, absolutely. But I think general public wise, like on my platforms, I think that it's just my privilege to be able to inform and educate.
Cool. When was your daughter diagnosed?
Very young. She was diagnosed when she was 3.5.
Oh, okay. This is something I've always kind of wanted to ask mothers of kids that have ADHD. When she was diagnosed, were you diagnosed after she was, or were you diagnosed before she was?
I was diagnosed after. So my diagnosis only came about a little bit over a year ago. So about a year and a half ago. But my oldest is also adopted. And so with her diagnosis, it wasn't like I was necessarily thinking that there would be a biological tie. But I'm certainly grateful that we can have a similar diagnosis and get to know it each together as well.
Oh my gosh, I never thought about that. Okay, like after you were diagnosed, did anything really change for you?
A lot. Uh-huh. A lot changed. So my journey was a little bit different. I had somewhat of a mental breakdown, a panic attack, whatever you can call it, that I think was induced by non-diagnosed ADHD. And that happened fall of 2019. And I wasn't officially diagnosed until the spring of 2020. And in between that time period, I started being really curious about if ADHD was what I was experiencing. And so that's when I opened up kind of my Instagram, my TikTok to kind of let people in on that journey and that process. And so I learned a lot in those 6 months before, I guess it was closer to 9 months before my diagnosis. I learned a lot about myself. And then once I was diagnosed, I think it was just like an affirmation of everything that you just learned and suspected being true. And I think I give myself a little bit more grace, a little bit more patient with myself. I think I don't overbook myself or give myself too many high expectations all at once. I'm a little bit more careful about my choices and what I say yes to. And I acknowledge the fact that when I have shortcomings, that those shortcomings aren't just because I'm a flaky human, as some people on the outside would see, that I can be very almost scientific about it and be very kind to myself and say, you know what, that actually happened because your brain was like, there's too much going on in it. And or that actually happened not because you feel that way, the way that you reacted, but because there was underlying things that weren't being taken care of because of your ADHD. And I think the last little thing I'd say is I'm currently pregnant. And so before my pregnancy, I was on medication every so often. And knowing that I have ADHD and I'm pregnant and I'm a little bit older in my pregnancy, all those things combined has been very helpful for me to be kind to myself. It's a little frustrating. It's a little bit difficult because I'm a doer. I really enjoy getting a lot done, but it's given me some space to be kinder to myself and to be more direct with the decisions that I'm making to make sure that I'm not just saying yes to everything and then burning out.
Yeah. I feel like I had a very similar experience. Like up until the point I was diagnosed, I was just kind of like, why am I like this? Like, am I just being lazy, this, that? And when I was diagnosed, it was going through, but it was a reason for why I had been like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a common thing among people who do get diagnosed at a much later time in their life.
It's so helpful.
Yeah.
It's so helpful. I think back on school and I think back on how I studied or how I struggled to take exams or just a variety of things that have really stood out in my mind as a little bit, I don't want to say traumas, but they're experiences that I remember over time. And I look back, I'm like, oh, that's why. that it gives reason and it gives a place for that to land. Yeah, it's helpful. Just like you said.
So, like when you were diagnosed, was it like an automatic like, oh, like I understand why I'm like this, or was it kind of like I'm this because of this, or like how did that process come about?
You cut out just a little bit, but I think I heard your question enough.
Okay.
Was it did I gradually kind of grow into my diagnosis, or was it just like a automatic change? Was that your question?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say it's definitely a gradual. It was a gradual thing. It's actually something I'm really passionate about talking about, is that there's no inappropriate or appropriate timetable for getting to know one's diagnosis, in my opinion. I think the more important thing is that we see it as individual, that even though there's a lot of scientific research out there, and that is absolutely helpful, that's what we should be basing, like what we should be reading to understand ourselves better, that we're not expected to know it all at once. Just because I was born female doesn't mean I understand my female body all at once. Just because I live in the United States of America doesn't mean that I understand all of the government of the United States of America all at once. Like it's like everything else, is even though it's a part of us, I think we do have to learn line upon line. We do have to learn a little bit at a time. And I think it's important to take it a bite at a time, or else, especially with ADHD, we become very overwhelmed and then we start to self-sabotage. So it's helpful, at least for me.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question is like, what do you think is like the root causes of kind of like the misconceptions of ADHD? Because you were talking about it earlier about how like you thought you were lazy and you thought all these different things. So I guess like, what do you think? Why do you think our society thinks that like ADHD automatically equates to like laziness or hyperactivity?
I think it's just a lack of education and different expectations. Many neurotypical, let's just take, for example, the workplace. Neurotypical workplace, the way that things are organized, it's very deadline driven. It's very linear driven, right? In order to accomplish a task, you move from point A to point B, and that's how the task is accomplished, and you do that one thing at a time. A lot of the time in the workplace, you have a client, they have a problem in an email, you contact them, and it's resolved, right? And you do that. Maybe you're working with 4 or 5 different clients, but it's almost the same work. In an ADHD brain, we don't work as linear as often. And so the expectation of how we need to show up in order to be successful, or in order to be organized, or in order to be responsible, that process oftentimes does not naturally line up with the way that our brain organizes information and the way that we execute on getting things done. So I think there's a big disconnect, because things need to still get done. Things need to still, move forward, and we need to have progress in what we're working on. But if a whole bunch of ADHDers are running the show, it would look very different. And the expectation of getting things on time or done would probably look a lot different. And the stress would be a lot different. So I think that might be one of them. I mean, the way that the traditional school systems are set up as well are very much geared toward neurotypicals. Being a teacher myself, I very naturally made a variety of different ways of learning. But even so, my students still, every student had a desk and had a place and had to put their stuff inside of a desk. And so there were still, things that I would change if I did things differently. So I think the expectations, the systems, the strategies, the way that neurotypical lifestyles are set up are the majority of what we're exposed to. And so anything that doesn't live up to that standard is seen as wrong or bad and labeled with things like lazy or disorganized, things like that.
Earlier, so you said you were a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could kind of like go back in time and change something about the way that you teach, because now you have ADHD, what would you change?
I have thought about this so many times. And I think that teaching is a very hard profession. And so I think that it's hard to say what I could have done differently. What I can say that what I did do and that actually worked is I used a lot of music in my classroom. I taught 6th grade, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. I used a lot of movement. I allowed my students to read a variety of literature they were interested in, not just what I thought they should read. That includes magazines. That included like gaming magazines. That included, anything that was interest driven, which I think is really helpful for ADHD. I bought like pillows, and I'd allow them to read around the classroom. I tried to do as much hands-on learning as possible, get outside the classroom. It snows where I live, so it got cold for most of the year, but we would still go outside and try and do stuff. So I made my attempts to do things like that, and I think it really helped. Taking brain breaks throughout the day to kind of regroup. I think it's just good practice in general with kids. But if I went back, there would be a lot. I think I would just have a different perspective on what success is and how to measure that success. I wouldn't be so stringent about, in order to pass your math test, it has to be in one specific way. I always my students to retake many times as they needed to. Ways of learning that also benefit neurodivergence and ADHD in specific. So that was helpful, but there's still a lot of things I go back and do differently.
Okay. Oof, sorry, I have an itchy back.
You're good. Mhm.
To kind of like bounce off of that other question I just asked and your answer, like what advice would you give to any like younger people who have recently been diagnosed with ADHD or who are living with ADHD right
Mm. So much.
now?
Usually tell people is that they're not alone and that their brain isn't weird and that their brain isn't, dumb or stupid or all these things that maybe they've been feeling or thinking, but that their brain has a capacity to do great things, and that now they have the opportunity to get to know how their brain works to their best ability. And for many people with ADHD, that can actually be a gift because most neurotypicals are not forced to get to know their brain until a tragedy happens or something down the line happens. But knowing that early on can be a gift, can be an opportunity for them to early on, before they go to college, before they get that job they want, to understand, you know what? If my boss asks me to do such and such and such and such, I know that's a trigger for my ADHD brain and body. And so when they say something like that, I need to make sure that I meet them where they're at and say, hey, no problem. Let's get really clear on what the result is, and then say, pretty awesome, that if they understand early on, then they're able to bring to college, to the workplace, to their family, to their future relationships, instead of having to deal with a lot of people like myself that didn't find out till I was 36. You're just going to save yourself a lot of heartache. So while it is very frustrating, and while ADHD has a lot of struggles that need to be addressed, that it's actually, it can be getting ahead of the game of most people, learning how to be responsible with your own self, learning how to have real true self-care early on in your life can actually be very beneficial in the long run.
So like with like the recent events that have happened, like with COVID, did COVID affect you in any sort of way, like in terms of your ADHD? Like, did it make you kind of be like you had like a lot of emotions about that, or was there like any side effects?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say the community, the ADHD community in general, the reason why my business did so well is because I would say a vast majority of my consultations that I took, people would say, I was doing okay when there was structure at work or structure at school, but now that it's all on me at home, I can't get anything done. And, they just feel very burdened by that lack of structure and that lack of socialization of people, seeing certain people there every day. Me personally, I was, so my mental breakdown, if you will, happened right before COVID hit. And so I was already kind of in a weird place. And for me, finding out ADHD was a thing right before COVID happened and allowing me to explore that, while all these other people with ADHD were looking for community and resources, to me, it was like a gift to be able to connect with so many people with ADHD that were going through such a hard time at my hardest time. But now kind of, at least in the state that I live in, we're kind of some major social anxiety that's happening, overwhelm. I'm overthinking a lot of things, overthinking things that wouldn't be a big deal before COVID. All of a sudden, I am wondering if I can actually follow through with. I am struggling to follow through with basic things that I didn't have trouble with before. And half of that might be pregnancy brain as well. But, I think that a lot of things shifted for me during COVID. So many things were beautiful and wonderful about being able to be home and not having to worry about outside pressures. But at the same time, now getting back into it, I'm recognizing, oh man, there's a lot more to this than I thought. Rejection as well. Rejection face to face versus just over the internet. Yeah, a lot of stuff.
I think what was so interesting for me about COVID was like I had like a certain structure to my day. And then when COVID hit, it was like Lego blocks just coming tumbling down on the ground. And I
Yeah.
was like, I don't know what to do. I'm not cope for this. Like I was going all over the place. And now it was like things coming back to light. Like there's a part of me that's like super excited. I'm like, just stay inside. We've
Yeah.
used that for the past year now. So I'm excited to see what the world looks like in a couple of months. Like maybe things will be back to normal. But like when like how did you find your, I guess you could say, your ADHD community? Like did you go on social media, or was it like you found somebody like face to face?
Yeah, so because it happened all over COVID, people actually started coming to me because of what I was posting on social media. And I felt this desire, almost this calling to get out and to start to tell my story, like I was saying. I knew if I was feeling this way, there were others that were probably feeling the same. And just some of my videos started getting some momentum on TikTok and then on Instagram, and people just started asking me questions. And if I didn't know the answers, then I'd go find articles and I'd send them to those. So I would say that community was just formed by being vulnerable myself and by reaching out to other people that, just like what you're doing, reaching out to other people that have ADHD and getting their perspective on their ADHD and what they've gained and learned in their life. Because once again, each one of our stories is very different, but it has this common thread. Helpful for me to learn from other people as well.
I like looked up ADHD when I was first kind of like researching about it and everything. There was only 2 symptoms listed on like the little like box on the side, and it was,
oh wow,
they were limited attention and hyperactivity. And I just want to know, from like one person has ADHD to another, like, do you think that is a correct summary of symptoms, or do you think that there should be more listed? And what do you think they should be?
Oh no, yeah. Those 2, I mean, like I said, I'm not a clinician, but there's a lot more to it than just those 2. That's for sure. I think that's an over exaggeration of, or it's more of a blanket statement of maybe what most people with ADHD might feel, piece of it, but there's so many others. And there are a lot of other influencers and advocates and professionals online that can spout off all of the very specific particulars that are found in the clinical ways that they're researching, ADHD. But that's not all of them, that's for sure. I'm not one that has all of those in my brain right now. There's commonly associated ones with ADHD. And so for this, I can say that there's a lot of commonly found symptoms for ADHD. Those things are like time blindness, not being able to organize your time, rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, the list goes on and on. Just not, let's see, ruminating thoughts. There's so many different things that are outside of just this attention thing, that I think both of those 2 things that you said were about attention and hyperactivity, right? And there's so much more to it. And that's why ADHD is such a complex, disorder, is because it isn't just about the attention. And most people you'll hear will say, we actually have plenty of attention. It's being able to direct that, being able to control that, being able to stop the attention in one area and not hyperfixate on it. Hyperfocus is another one of those. The DSM-5 is the most common evaluation used for ADHD and listed in that DSM-5, there are many, many indicators of ADHD that would be much more helpful than just the two that you saw.
Okay, so just to kind of round off this interview, kind of one of the focuses of my entire project is about women, and it's about women in ADHD because women are significantly underdiagnosed than men. So my question to you is, why do you think women who have ADHD are underdiagnosed, and why do you think they get diagnosed at such a later time in their life?
That's a good question.
It doesn't have to be like a scientific answer.
Yeah. So I'll just, once again, don't take this as like the science behind it. But what I have gathered and learned in the past year as a woman with ADHD is a variety of things that are really kind of fun to celebrate sometimes about women in general, and kind of the resilience that women have. We don't give up very easily. We don't draw attention to ourselves a whole ton. So a lot of women with ADHD, they're more the inattentive type. They're the daydreamers. They're the ones that are going to find something else to be interesting if what's in front of them isn't interesting. And so they can be very entertaining in their own brains. They can look like they're right with you and paying attention, but they're actually in their own world internally. And so that's a little bit harder for your parent or a mentor to pick up on in order to get a diagnosis. Hormones play a very big role as well. The hormonal cycle and how ADHD presents itself with our hormones. And so a lot of the time you might hear people say, oh, you're just PMSing, or, oh, she's just this, that, and the other. It must be that time of month. And they just dismiss a lot of the symptoms like memory issues, short-term memory problems, and different things that, yes, they can be hormonal issues, but not always. Like there has to be an on switch, at some point. And so they can be dismissed that way as well. I also think, and I'm just talking to my own therapist about this, about emotional intelligence. And a lot of the time women, this is a general statement, but women have a little bit more opportunity to be more intuitive emotionally. And with ADHD, that means that it looks like a little bit less explosive, a little bit less intense because of that emotional maturity and that social maturity of understanding what's going on around us. So we're able to mask what we're really feeling inside, or how we're coping inside. We can mask those feelings because we know it's not socially appropriate to act in a different way, or it's not emotionally, like our emotional intelligence is a little bit more refined than many males in that way. Don't do all those type of kind of jumbled, but those are just some things I've kind of picked up over time. Once again, like, don't quote me like a scientist or a psychologist, but I think that looking back, we have a lot more dismissals, like we just dismissed as being a woman, or being quiet, or entertaining ourselves because we're very creative that way, being quiet. But at the same time, my daughter is very, very large in her energy, so she definitely didn't fit that. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, did it cut out like a lot at the end?
Yeah, I was like, oh no, I can't hear.
Okay, was there anything I need to repeat, or do you think you got most of it?
I think I got most of it, hopefully. If not,
Okay.
it's okay.
Okay.
By the way, it was really nice talking to you. It was really nice hearing about your experience. And I might come back and ask you some more questions.
Yeah, please do. And yeah, feel free. I'm glad that it worked out, and today was a good day for it. So it works out.